Picture a man, right. He's walking slowly through the freezing streets of a major city, and he's holding a lit lantern just straight out at arm's length.
Yeah, which sounds like, I don't know, a quirky historical anecdote, like
Yeah.
maybe some kind of traditional winter festival or something.
Exactly, but what you're actually looking at is a city right in the middle of a mass casualty event, like a catastrophe where up to 12,000 people are actively dying, and nobody has actually noticed yet.
Right, because inching forward at a walking pace right behind that man with the lantern is a massive double-decker bus.
Wow.
Yeah, the driver of that multi-ton vehicle cannot see the road. He cannot see the curb. He is, for all intents and purposes, completely blind,
Just following the lantern.
following the faint orange glow of a lantern hovering like 6 feet ahead of his windshield. And the craziest part is this wasn't an isolated incident. For several days, this was literally the only way the entire public transportation system of London was able to function.
That is just wild. Welcome to this deck dive, everyone. Our mission today is to explore a stack of, quite frankly, incredibly haunting sources detailing the Great Smog of London in December of 1952.
Yeah, it's everyone.
We're examining how a city's own completely familiar waste product turned lethal practically overnight, and more importantly, we are unpacking the psychological terror of a disaster so gradual and so terrifyingly normal seeming on its surface that it essentially disguised itself as just bad weather.
And to really understand this, we are drawing on a super robust range of sources today. We're looking at historical accounts and diaries from the people who actually lived through that week.
Which are fascinating to read.
Oh, absolutely. Plus, we've got contemporary public health reports, modern epidemiological modeling of mortality rates, and the parliamentary records surrounding the landmark environmental legislation that was ultimately forced into existence.
Right. And as we go through these sources, keep in mind this isn't just a history lesson about meteorology or weather patterns.
No, not at all.
This is a profound look into human psychology. It's about what happens when an entire society basically accepts a lethal hazard as, quote unquote, normal. Because to understand how London could casually watch thousands of its own citizens die without instantly panicking, I mean, we have to start with the environment they built.
Yeah, the baseline.
Right. The sources paint a picture of a city completely, entirely addicted to coal.
It was the absolute bedrock of post-war British life. Like, if we transport ourselves to the early 1950s, London's infrastructure, its economy, its domestic heating, literally everything ran on coal.
And we aren't just talking about, huge industrial power stations out on the outskirts of town.
No, we're talking about millions of individual household chimneys. Almost every single family living room had a coal hearth that just burned constantly straight through the winter.
I was reading through the economic records from our sources, and the type of coal they were burning is it's the critical variable here, right?
Oh, yeah, it changes everything.
Because after the Second World War, Britain was under massive financial pressure to pay off its war debts. So the government, which had actually just recently nationalized the coal industry, they took all the high-quality, hard, clean-burning anthracite coal and exported it.
They shipped the good stuff out, leaving the domestic market with what was essentially the bottom of the barrel. They literally called it nutty slack.
Nutty slack, what a name.
Right, it is this highly inefficient, dusty, low-grade coal, and crucially, it had an incredibly high sulfur content. So when you burn high sulfur coal, it doesn't just release carbon, it releases massive amounts of sulfur dioxide gas and thick, particulate-laden smoke.
Which means you have millions of household chimneys, plus the factories embedded right within the city limits, all of them just pumping out this thick, sulfurous soot every single day.
Just a constant stream of it.
And because of this constant output, the city was incredibly prone to thick, yellowish fogs. I mean, Londoners had been living with them for generations at this point. They even had a nickname for them, right? Pea soupers.
Yeah, pea soupers. And the psychology behind that nickname is actually really fascinating when you think about it.
How so?
Well, pea super sounds almost affectionate. It reveals a really deep societal normalization of severe pollution. Generations of Londoners had grown up reading Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle, where these swirling fogs were romanticized as part of the mysterious character of the city itself.
Right, it was like the aesthetic of London.
Exactly. They didn't view a yellow fog as an environmental catastrophe. They viewed it as a defining civic trait.
I think about how modern cities treat brutal traffic gridlock today. Like if you live in Los Angeles or London right now, and it takes you 2 hours to drive 3 miles, You don't call emergency services and say your life is in danger.
You get laughed off the phone.
Right. You just groan, you turn up the radio, and you accept it as the miserable reality of living in your city. It's a chronic annoyance. You complain about it constantly, but you never view it as an active threat to your survival.
It's just the baseline of existence there. The pea super meant your shirt collar got dirty faster. Or you might be late to the office because the tram was running slow. It was completely woven into the cultural fabric.
So it's just another Tuesday for them.
Yeah. So when the weather began to shift on Friday, December 5th, 1952, the population was totally primed to interpret what was happening through the lens of just mere inconvenience.
Right. But what actually happened on December 5th was a meteorological trap snapping shut. The sources detail that a massive anticyclone settled directly over London.
And because we're dealing with an anticyclone here, you already know we're looking at a massive high-pressure system. But the mechanics of what that high pressure did to the air over the city are just terrifying.
Yeah. Walk us through that physics, because it's wild.
The physics of it created a perfect atmospheric lock. When this high-pressure system parked itself over the Thames Valley, it brought completely windless conditions. The air just became totally stagnant. And as high-pressure air descends, it compresses and warms up.
Right.
This creates a phenomenon known as a temperature inversion.
Which is backwards from how it usually works, right? Normally, air gets colder the higher up you go in the atmosphere.
Exactly.
And that temperature gradient is what allows warm, polluted air from, say, ground-level chimneys to rise naturally and disperse into the upper atmosphere.
But the anticyclone completely inverted that natural order. You suddenly had this layer of relatively warm air sitting high above the city, trapping a much colder, denser layer of air right down at ground level.
Like a ceiling.
Precisely like a ceiling. And London, geographically, sits in a river valley. It's essentially a shallow basin. So this cold, dense air pooled in the basin, and the warm air above acted like an impermeable, invisible lid.
The cruel irony here, like the feedback loop that turned this from just bad weather into a literal massacre, is the temperature. It was absolutely freezing down in that trapped ground level layer.
Bitterly cold.
And what did millions of Londoners naturally do when the temperature plummeted? They went right to their hearths and shoveled more of that cheap, sulfur-rich, nutty slack onto the fire.
Which means they were inadvertently fueling their own gas chamber.
Wow.
Every puff of black smoke coming out of millions of chimneys, every single plume of vehicle exhaust, every cloud of industrial emissions drifted up a few hundred feet, hit that invisible ceiling of warm air, and just bounced right back down into the streets. It literally had nowhere to go.
Let's break down the chemistry of what they were actually breathing, because the sources are very clear that this wasn't just, normal water vapor.
No, far from it.
When that sulfur dioxide gas from the cheap coal hit the moisture in the stagnant fog, it didn't just hang there. It underwent a massive chemical reaction.
Right. The sulfur dioxide dissolved into the water droplets and oxidized, forming actual sulfuric acid. So the fog wasn't just obscuring vision, right? It was a highly acidic aerosol.
An aerosol of acid.
Yeah, it was thick with terry soot particles completely coated in acid. People describe the fog as having a distinct physical taste, like a combination of coal smoke and rotten eggs.
Ugh. And it stung your eyes. It coated the back of your throat. And yet the immediate reaction of the city wasn't panic. The atmospheric lid slams shut. The city is literally filling with sulfuric acid. And people just adjust their routines. They think, well, it's just a particularly nasty pea super today.
They fell back on their normalized behaviors. And over the next 5 days, from Friday, December 5th through Tuesday, December 9th, that trap just slowly, inexorably tightened.
The sources track this day by day, and the escalation is horrifying. The visibility didn't just drop to a few feet. By the weekend, it dropped to effectively zero.
Zero visibility.
People reported looking down and being unable to see their own shoes.
The sheer physical disorientation of that is hard to overstate. Imagine walking a route you've taken every single day for 10 years, right? From your office to your flat.
You'd think you know it by heart.
You'd think so. But suddenly, the visual landmarks you unconsciously rely on are just gone. People were trailing their hands along the rough brick walls of buildings just to find the corners of their own streets.
That's so eerie.
And some people actually fell into the River Thames because they literally couldn't see the edge of the embankment.
The infrastructure of urban survival just completely dissolved. We mentioned the lantern-guided buses earlier, but the medical infrastructure failed completely too. Ambulance services fundamentally ceased to function.
They couldn't move.
Right. If you had a heart attack, the dispatcher couldn't get a vehicle to you, drivers couldn't find the addresses, and even if they could, they couldn't drive faster than a slow walking pace. Paramedics were forced to just abandon their vehicles and try to walk to emergencies with their medical kits in hand.
The whole city essentially ground to a halt. But even as the transit and medical systems failed, there's a specific detail in the historical accounts that perfectly illustrates the profound cognitive dissonance of the public.
Oh, you're talking about the Smithfield show.
Yes, the Smithfield Club Cattle Show at Earl's Court.
Such a bizarre detail.
It was a major, prestigious agricultural exhibition taking place right as the smog hit. Farmers from all over the country had brought in their absolute best prize-winning livestock.
And these are massive, robust animals, like incredibly healthy.
Yeah, the best of the best. And the air inside the exhibition halls, which, keep in mind, were huge, cavernous spaces, became so thick with sulfur and soot that the cattle started exhibiting severe respiratory distress.
You had veterinarians just running through the halls as the animals went into active respiratory failure. Several of these incredibly strong animals actually asphyxiated. They literally choked to death on the atmosphere of London.
It's awful. The sources describe farmers frantically fashioning makeshift gas masks for their cows out of grain sacks soaked in whiskey, just trying to filter the acid out of the air.
Sacks soaked in whiskey. It's like an apocalyptic scene. And this is where I just have to pause, because human psychology is baffling to me here.
It really is.
If you are a citizen of London, right, you can't see your own feet, the ambulances are paralyzed, and you read in the morning paper that prize-winning cattle are dropping dead from simply breathing. Why wasn't there a mass exodus? Like, why didn't people riot or flee the city or demand government action right that second?
Well, it comes down to how we process danger. Because disasters, in our evolutionary psychology, are supposed to announce themselves with a bang. An earthquake violently shakes the ground, a flood rushes in, a building collapses.
There's a clear event.
Exactly. Those acute dramatic events instantly trigger our primal fight-or-flight response. We instantly recognize the rupture in reality, but the Great Smog had no inciting incident.
There was no explosion. It was just an ordinary winter nuisance getting slightly cumulatively worse each hour.
Exactly. And because it visually resembled a totally familiar pea souper, the public's collective brain categorized it as a known manageable annoyance.
You've seen this before, we'll survive it again.
Right. And once human beings categorize a threat as routine, it is incredibly difficult to overwrite that assessment, even when you're presented with escalating contradictory evidence like dying cattle. We rationalize the anomalies just to maintain the illusion of normality.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the boiling frog metaphor. Because the onset was so gradual, the collective alarm bells never rang. But there's another factor the sources highlight: the physical isolation caused by the fog itself.
Yeah, the fog acted as a giant sensory deprivation chamber for the entire city. You couldn't see the panic on your neighbors' faces because you literally couldn't see your neighbors.
There was no visual feedback.
None. There were no television broadcasts showing sweeping aerial shots of a devastated city because cameras couldn't penetrate the smog. The true scope of the event was entirely hidden from the very people experiencing it.
Which makes the reality of what was happening indoors so much more chilling. Because while healthy adults were stumbling along brick walls and complaining about the transit delays outside, a silent massacre was unfolding in the private bedrooms of the city.
The true catastrophe was entirely atomized. During those 5 days, hospitals began seeing a marked, relentless rise in patients presenting with severe hypoxia and breathing difficulties.
But it wasn't a sudden, visible flood of trauma victims like you'd see after, say, a train derailment.
No, it was just a steady, quiet trickle of people suffocating.
And we have to look at the physiology of who was actually dying here.
Yeah.
Because this environmental hazard was highly predatory. The victims were overwhelmingly the most vulnerable members of society: the very young, the elderly, and basically anyone with a pre-existing cardiac or respiratory condition.
Right. If you already suffered from asthma or chronic bronchitis, which, by the way, was incredibly common in London at the time due to the lifelong coal exposure we talked about.
Oh, for sure.
Or if you had a weak heart, this air was lethal. The sulfuric acid aerosols we discussed earlier actively attack the delicate tissue of the lungs.
I want to dig into the cellular mechanics of that because the medical reports from the sources are just grim. When you inhale sulfuric acid, It burns the cilia, the tiny hair-like structures in your airways that are supposed to sweep out debris.
It strips your defenses.
Exactly. And then it causes rapid, severe inflammation of the alveoli, which are the tiny air sacs where oxygen actually enters the blood.
And when the alveoli are burned by acid, the body naturally responds with inflammation, and fluid rushes into the lungs. The patients were experiencing pulmonary edema.
So they were basically drowning.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Drowning in their own biological response to the air. Their lips and skin were turning blue from cyanosis because oxygen simply couldn't cross the inflamed lung tissue into their bloodstream.
And the nature of these casualties is what makes this disaster so historically unique, I think. These deaths did not happen in the streets in front of crowds. They happened individually behind closed doors.
They happened in quiet, isolated flats and just overcrowded hospital wards.
Imagine the psychological weight of that for a second. You are an elderly person with a bad cough. You are trapped in your freezing flat. The air inside your own bedroom is thick, yellow, and smells like sulfur.
You can't even escape it indoors.
Right. You're gasping for breath, assuming you've just caught a terrible bout of winter bronchitis. You are completely cut off from the world outside because you can't see out the window, and you know the doctors can't get to you.
And the most tragic part is you are entirely unaware that thousands of other people across your city are fighting the exact same losing battle in the dark at that exact same moment.
It is structurally invisible. The tragedy was broken down into thousands of individual, unconnected private horrors rather than one shared civic trauma. The healthy people walking the streets, covering their mouths with scarves, literally did not know that mass death was occurring inside the terraced houses they were walking right past.
So the city simply endures it, assuming it's just a miserable week. And then finally, on Tuesday, December 9th, the meteorological trap opens up.
The weather breaks.
The anticyclone moves on, the wind finally returns, the invisible lid lifts, and the smog just blows out toward the North Sea.
The sky clears. The city breathes a collective sigh of relief, thinking, thank God that bad weather has passed. But as the sources reveal, the true nightmare of those 5 days was really only just becoming mathematically visible.
Yeah, the aftermath of the Great Smog wasn't measured in collapsed buildings or rubble. You didn't look outside and see a ruined city. The architecture was pristine.
The damage was entirely biological.
Exactly. Instead of rubble, the scale of the disaster was measured in municipal shortages.
Yeah.
And the metrics here are just macabre.
Serious.
Undertakers across London critically ran short of coffins. They completely ran out of the wood needed to build them and the black funeral cloth used to drape them.
I read that florists ran entirely out of flowers, too.
Yes, the entire supply chain of death and mourning was completely overwhelmed. That is how the city finally began to realize what had happened. It wasn't through a dramatic prime minister's address on the radio. It was through the sudden, horrifying inability to book a funeral.
Imagine being an undertaker that week. You're getting call after call from grieving families, and suddenly you look at your ledger and realize you have absolutely zero coffins left. You call the undertaker in the next borough to borrow some, and they have none either.
It's this creeping, terrifying realization of the scale of the death toll.
This is where the public health officials had to step in and confront the invisible math of the tragedy. They had to figure out exactly how many people the smog had killed. And the initial official estimates, drawn from contemporaneous reporting, attributed roughly 4,000 excess deaths to those 5 days.
I want to break down that term, excess deaths, because it's a really specific epidemiological tool. You can't just count every single death certificate in London that week and blame it on the fog, because people die every day in a major city from natural causes, accidents, and old age.
Right, you need a baseline.
Correct. To find the true toll, statisticians look at the baseline mortality rates for previous comparable Decembers. Say, for example, London usually sees 1,500 deaths a week in early December. During the week of the smog, they might see 5,500 deaths. The difference between the baseline expectation and the massive spike is the excess mortality. That mathematical difference, those 4,000 bodies, were the ones directly attributable to the environmental event.
Which, just to pause on that, 4,000 people dying from a 5-day weather event is staggering. That is a historic, generational catastrophe. But the decades later statistical modeling we have in our sources doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't. And this is where the historical narrative takes a really significant turn. Decades later, epidemiologists and environmental historians went back to re-examine the data. because the initial 4,000 figure only looked at the deaths that occurred during and immediately after the 5 days of the smog.
Right, but the biological damage didn't just magically vanish when the wind blew the fog away?
Exactly. The human lung is incredibly fragile, and it doesn't heal easily from chemical burns. The people who inhaled those concentrated levels of sulfuric acid didn't all die immediately. Tens of thousands of people suffered catastrophic respiratory damage that continued to degrade over time. Their lungs continued to fail weeks and even months later.
So modern researchers looked at the mortality data for January and February of 1953, and the modern estimates they produced are terrifying. They suggest the true death toll may be as high as 10,000 to 12,000 people.
It's a massive escalation.
Wait, I have to push back here a little bit because going from 4,000 to 12,000 is a massive jump. It's basically tripling the death toll. How can modern modelers be sure that an elderly person dying in late January was killed by the fog in early December and not just from, a really bad winter flu season?
That is the crucial epidemiological debate, and interestingly, it was the exact defense the government used at the time to avoid blame. Yes. But to separate the smog deaths from influenza, modern researchers used incredibly sophisticated spatial and temporal modeling. They looked at clinical swab data and regional health records to map the actual spread of the influenza virus that winter.
And what did they find?
They found that the flu epidemic didn't actually peak until much later in the winter. And more importantly, it wasn't nearly severe enough to account for the massive, sustained spike in respiratory deaths that immediately followed the smog.
Yeah, so they essentially mathematically subtract the flu deaths out of the equation, and they are still left with thousands of unexplained respiratory failures.
Precisely. However, it is vital to note that the 10,000 to 12,000 figure remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. It is a methodologically sound revision, but it is not an uncontested final number. What it proves, unequivocally though, is that the disaster's lethal tail was incredibly long.
The smog basically planted the seeds of respiratory failure that harvested lives for the rest of the winter. So you have a situation where somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000 people have died. And as you said, you cannot hide thousands of excess bodies. When the coffins run out, the public demands answers. The grief and the deep civic disgust finally shattered the illusion of the acceptable pea souper. It forced a massive political reckoning.
It did, but the government didn't concede immediately. Harold Macmillan, who was the Minister of Housing and Local Government at the time, initially tried to deflect responsibility.
Shocking.
Right. He heavily leaned on that influenza narrative we just talked about, suggesting the deaths were just a natural tragedy of winter illness, not a systemic failure of energy policy.
Because accepting responsibility meant fundamentally overhauling the entire British economy and changing how every single citizen heated their home. That is politically terrifying.
A nightmare for any politician.
But the pressure from medical professionals, public health advocates, and the sheer undeniable mathematics of the death toll forced the government to form the Beaver Committee to officially investigate the disaster.
And the recommendations of that committee directly resulted in the Clean Air Act of 1956. This is widely considered one of the most monumental pieces of environmental public health legislation in history.
Let's look at what the act actually did, because it wasn't just a polite suggestion to burn cleaner coal. It aggressively intervened in private life. The sources outlined that it introduced smoke control areas in urban zones,
Which was a completely revolutionary concept at the time. Local municipal authorities were given the power to designate massive zones across the city where only smokeless fuels could be burned. It heavily restricted the burning of the low-grade, high-emission, nutty slack that had literally been the lifeblood of the British hearth.
And it didn't just ban the cheap coal. It provided actual financial subsidies to households to convert their old open grates to new appliances that could burn smokeless solid fuels or use electricity or gas.
They essentially paid the public to change their habits.
The historical significance of the 1956 Act really cannot be overstated. It was one of the first times a major industrialized nation legally codified the idea that the air over a city is a protected public utility.
Yes, that's the key shift.
It established that citizens and corporations do not have the infinite right to pollute a shared resource, even in the pursuit of heating their own private living rooms.
It literally changed the architecture of domestic life. That is a massive intrusion of public policy into the private sphere, and the British public accepted it because the trauma of the 1952 mass casualty event was just so deep.
The philosophical shift was profound. But the tragedy really is the cost of that shift. The legislation fundamentally changed society's relationship with its own industrial waste. But it took thousands of quiet, agonizing deaths in freezing bedrooms to overcome the massive inertia of normalcy and force that structural change.
Bringing this all together, the story of the Great Smog isn't really a story about freak weather. It is a story about the lethal danger of familiarity. Familiarity didn't protect a single person in London in 1952. It just delayed their realization that they were in mortal danger.
They looked at a toxic, acidic gas cloud that was actively dissolving their lungs, and because they were used to it, they saw a beloved, slightly annoying civic quirk.
The most dangerous version of a problem isn't the one that looks new and terrifying. Like, if a glowing neon green alien fog had descended on London, everyone would have evacuated instantly.
Oh, absolutely. The fight or flight response would have saved them.
Right. The most dangerous hazard is the one that looks exactly like something you've already wrongly learned to tolerate.
It is the hazard that disguises itself as routine. It's the disaster that blends into the background of everyday life until it reaches a critical, catastrophic threshold.
Which is exactly what happened here.
Looking back over this whole deep dive, it is a staggering journey. We started with that single man walking in the freezing dark, holding a lantern to guide a blind double-decker bus. We moved into the terrifying silence of the hospital wards, exploring the cellular breakdown of human lungs.
We saw the macabre accounting of the florists and the undertakers trying to process a mountain of invisible bodies.
And finally, we watched a nation fundamentally rewrite its laws and its relationship with the very air it breathes.
It serves as a stark historical reminder that public health and environmental policy almost exclusively advance in the wake of tragedy. Systemic change rarely happens proactively. It happens when the undeniable mathematics of mortality finally outweigh the economic convenience of the status quo.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final, lingering question. Building on what we've learned from how Londoners normalize their own slow destruction, I want you to look at the systems around you today. As you go about your week, driving your car, participating in your city's economy, scrolling through the news, what is the modern pea souper in our society?
What is the creeping hazard we look at every single day without truly seeing it?
What slow, pervasive, completely familiar threat are we currently accepting as just the weather? What problem are we endlessly complaining about as a minor inconvenience, quietly waiting for our own version of the coffins to run out before we finally decide to change the rules? Think about that faint orange glow of the lantern in the dark and ask yourself what it is we are refusing to see right in front of us.